Good evening, everybody. Welcome. You don't have to clap yet. I'm Deborah Crone, Associate Professor and Chair of Academic Programs here at BGC. Just for those of you who are not so familiar with us, we're a graduate research institute dedicated to the study of decorative arts, design, history, and material culture. And I'd like now respectfully to acknowledge this place as Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, and recognize New York as a past, current, and future home for many Indigenous people. Land acknowledgements honor customary Indigenous protocols for the thanking of hosts and call attention to ongoing realities of colonial dispossession. We also remember and honor the essential contributions of others who traveled to these lands against their free will. Critically examining our placement in the historical fabric of New York City is part of our effort to work toward more equitable futures. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Guffey, this year's winner of the Iris Foundation Award for Outstanding Mid-Career Scholar. The Outstanding Mid-Career Scholar Award is traditionally chosen by the BGC faculty for important contributions to the field of decorative arts, design history, and material culture studies, and will be formally presented tomorrow at our annual Iris Awards lunch, together with this year's other distinguished honorees. Elizabeth Guffey joins previous winners, including Anne Lafont, Sanchita Balachandran, Lori Wilkie, Jason Sun, Evelyn Welch, Giorgio Riello, Finbar Barry Flood, John Stiles, Glenn Adamson, Elisa Lagama, and many others. Elizabeth Guffey's pioneering work at the intersection of design history and disability studies is required reading for students of material and visual culture in a variety of fields, including many students at BGC. At the State University of New York at Purchase, she's professor and director of the MA program in modern and contemporary art, criticism, and theory, and holds a PhD in art history from Stanford University. Elizabeth has published widely and for a variety of audiences. An edited volume, After Universal Design, The Disability Design Revolution, is forthcoming from Bloomsbury. Making Disability Modern, co-edited with Bess Williamson, was published by Bloomsbury in 2020. In 2018, Designing Disability, Symbols, Spaces, and Society appeared, where Guffey explores how design symbols can alter the environment and make a person more or less disabled depending on the use of design. Retro, The Culture of Revival, was published by Reaction in 2006 and then translated into Chinese in 2010. In addition to these books, she's come out with a long list of articles and book chapters, as well as many influential writings for the popular press, such as Blocked Parking Spots, Broken Sidewalks and Boulders, How Common Spaces Fail People with Disabilities, published in The Nation in 2020, and The Only Chair That Changed the World in Icon magazine. Intriguing titles. Other articles include The Scandinavian Roots of the International Symbol of Access, from Design and Culture in 2015, and Crafting Yesterday's Tomorrows, Retrofuturism, Steampunk, and the Problem of Making in the 21st Century in the Journal of Modern Craft. She served as editor-in-chief for the peer-reviewed Journal of Design and Culture, which she also founded between 2008 and 2018, and this is really only the tip of the iceberg. In addition to the extensive list of publications, she's delivered a broad array of talks at conferences and meetings, such as the Design History Society and the College Art Association, and at many academic institutions. Above all, I'd like to signal the tremendous contributions that Elizabeth has made to the field of disability studies and design, which she has largely created. As a teacher and mentor, she has engaged in a seemingly endless list of peer reviews, served on myriad committees, both at Purchase and at many other institutions, and advised museums and other organizations. It is through this work as a teacher and mentor, which, like many disabilities, is invisible, that her work has made such a difference to the ways in which we think about and study both the past and present. I'm therefore honored and humbled to present this year's Mid-Career Scholar awardee, Elizabeth Guffey.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And also, it's a great honor to be here. It's especially a pleasure to be among so many friends. I often have so many good experiences at Bard. And I have to say, I've actually workshopped some of these ideas here at Bard before. So it's not what I'm talking about is probably not entirely new to everybody here. But I'm offering it also in the spirit of work in progress. Before I do that, though, I do want to give, in the spirit of disability studies and the kind of criticism that I'm about to do, the kind of scholarly work, I want to mention as an access note that I am going to try to model as well the type of scholarship that I perform. And specifically in terms of access for anyone who is vision impaired, I will try to describe the images as well as we go forward. And in addition to that, I'll try to speak as clearly and slowly as I can. And also for the ASL interpreter, it did just occur to me before this talk that I have some French words in this talk, and they don't translate that well into American Sign Language. So in fact, I will try to gloss those over into English as well. So in any case, I'm very glad to be here, and I will, with no further ado, begin my talk, which is Cripping Things in Late 19th Century Art, Disability, and Material Culture. So I'm going to begin with asking a question first. What do you think? How did Renoir cope with rheumatoid arthritis? Did Edgar Degas have inherited retinal degeneration? Was blue the only hue that Monet could see? When you read these words, I should say to you, these have been headlines in medical journals of all places. And would you believe, to see them, you would think that all the impressionists are blind and crippled. Now, traditionally, art historians actually try to play these sorts of questions down. And I have to say that generally, even though that's the case, what I want to do tonight is something different. I want to fully acknowledge these artists and their embodiments, but also to look at them somewhat differently. So I want to talk about the intersection between disability, objects, and making. And I want to do this not really at all, actually, by repeating these kind of older narratives of tragedy and loss, which is usually what you read about when you're really reading these medical journals. But rather, I'm going to speak tonight in terms of disability gain. So as I do this, I'm going to turn to this image, which is of Renoir at his easel. To introduce this idea, is looking at Renoir, you have to remember this was taken in 1914. Indeed, he is seated in a wheelchair. He's clenching in his bandaged fists a paintbrush and at work at an easel. We see here Renoir in the process of making art. But I want to examine this process in broader terms too today. So, in fact, I want to frame this within the broader idea of cryptistemology. That is essentially putting together two words. First, it is, first of all, crip, which is actually an appropriated term that disabled people use. It essentially involves taking over a previously pejorative term and remaking it into something different. In this way, it's much like the word queer, for example. It's reclaimed as a term that was previously used, and in fact, gay people use queer, now redeploying it as a point of pride, a term of pride. In this case, though, I'm also gesturing to a much broader spectrum of non-normative embodiments, and so it lays claim to a kind of identity. I'm coupling that with epistemology, too, essentially the philosophical study of human knowledge. So that is, of course, the studying of ways that we experience and process the world, what we might call ways of knowing. So when I'm talking about cryptistemology, I'm also giving a nod in this to Mary Lisa Johnson and Robert McCrua. And indeed, they are the ones who coined this term. They not only define the term, but they also mention its ubiquity once you know what you're looking for. As I'm arguing, I can believe that we can apply cryptistemology to a range of forms of making. That is, ways of proceeding through the world, the ways we initiate and carry out processes, the very sorts of aesthetic practices that we develop all come from a variety of ways of experiencing the world. But to do this, what I really want to emphasize tonight is, in fact, something that I'm calling crip objects. And I'm doing that here, especially at the BGC, which I think is a good place for us to kind of think through this idea of cryptistemology and how it can be deeply tied to the material world. But I want to explore that through the form of material culture. And as I call these things crip objects, I think that we'll see that what they can really explore is a whole different kind of way of being. The objects, we all know objects can do lots of different things. They can tell us about values, they can describe ideologies, entire worldviews. But here today, I want to explore how objects can instantiate cryptistemology by looking at the ways that disability, and especially human difference, how that can be accounted for in our understanding of critical making processes. I want to make this clear as we look at a kind of remarkable object evidence. I want to make this clear that there are larger arguments to be made for crip gain. And that's really what I'm aiming for tonight. It's an argument in which I posit that creativity can come not despite disability, but rather because of it. So in my current work, I've been looking primarily at the 19th century, and for a couple of different reasons, 19th century art. It's a particularly good moment for investigating these ideas. Indeed, in art history, we discuss this is a moment that really starts to initiate what is normally thought of as modernism or modernity itself. And I'm showing you here Monet's Gare Saint-Lazare, the railway station. And through the steam and smoke, you can see the glass and metal of the railway station, as well as the emerging city of modern Paris in the background. And of course, this image reminds us of the period's nascent modernity, too. The rise of cities, the advent of the industrial era, the beginning of mass culture. We can all look for that image to describe that. The 19th century is also, though, a remarkable moment as it marks the ascendancy of Western science as a profession, and it also shapes a series of research protocols in universities and laboratories. And here I'm showing you, of course, a group of young researchers who were bent over lab tables. Not insignificantly, it's also a moment in which we can trace the roots of the modern medical profession, too. But I'm also want to take that idea one step further. Here I'm showing you a medical diagram of the human eye. And I also note that this is a period in which individual sensory experience became a kind of neuroscientific endeavor, leading to the study and fuller categorization of ideas of tactility and hapticity and vision. Essentially, it was a moment when the human sensorium was codified, rationalized, and connected to the body and mind. All of these issues then inform impressionist art, which in turn can be related to questions of embodiment. And now I'm turning to a painting by Renoir that actually depicts Monet, painting with a painting palette in his hand, and he's standing with his easel in his backyard. And you may have noticed I've been using this term body, and I'm using it in ways that scholars more precisely do call embodiment. It's the interaction between our physical corpus then and all the possibilities and meanings that are held in the world external to it. It's a hard concept, honestly, to get right. The common ways that many of us talk about our bodies is as a thing that we have. But really, it's also we're talking about a group of phenomenon that we are. And in many ways, there is a great variety and variability to that. And that is a subject of constant change as well. So as I'm talking about this, just bear in mind the idea of impressionist embodiment. And certainly, those ideas of embodiment are an aspect of Impressionism, though it's not as much discussed in scholarly terms. It is an art that, at least in some circles, was believed to lay claim to the sensorium and bodily interface with the material world. Impressionist art has traditionally been seen as the result of unalloyed vision. I'm showing you here a Renoir painting, of course, and we're on the side of the Seine River, and there are people milling about. You can see the quay, you can see some boats off to the side as well. And a lot of people would say that this is supposed to be a record of the whole range of reactions to the changing scenery, as well as effects in weather and light and atmosphere, all reflected and put onto the painted canvas. So these ideas have shaped my 3 case studies that we're going to be looking at here. All of them, I believe, make a case for the place of crip objects and cryptistomology. And again, to be specific, I'm going to talk about these artists' disability not as a barrier, which is the usual way that it's dealt with, but instead as something that allowed and even enabled them to look at the world in a different way and to make art that was an extension at a newly arrived at subjectivity. So first, to begin with, I'd like to turn to a film of Renoir at work. Nadia, we can go ahead with it. So we actually have this rare footage of Renoir painting. And it's fascinating to look at, isn't it? It's a kind of remarkable film. It's from 1915. And in this footage, you can see Renoir. He's been filmed by the Russian-born actor Sacha Guitry, who is using the newly invented film camera, in fact. And you see in it the 74-year-old artist. Of course, he's sitting before an easel. And notice how he leans back and forth with his brush in hand. You literally see him dance that brush across the canvas, too. He pauses occasionally also. He appraises what he's doing. As you can see here, yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, how often do we actually have this kind of footage of an artist, one of these really kind of iconic artists at work? So he pauses, he appraises. He's actually with his 14-year-old son, too, Claude, who's in the background. I don't know if you can see Claude's suit there. And Claude is repeatedly assisting him. Of course, Renoir stops. Yes, he's puffing on a cigarette. Notice how, the cigarette and the paintbrush seem to be this almost interchangeable thing in his hand, too. So he pulls back and he squints and he looks at the work. Now he's talking with Sacha Guitry as well. So that's the filmmaker himself who's seated behind him. Claude goes ahead and arranges the palette, puts the brush in his father's hand. One of the things I take away from this the most, the first time I saw this, is it reminds me of what a personable guy I think Renoir had to have been. You get a sense of the way he's really engaged with talking with Guitry. It looks like he could spend as much time in conversation than painting, too. All right. Thank you, Nadia. We can switch off with that. Yeah, it's a great thing to look at. I've had a lot of fun while watching it. But I do want to make one thing clear. While Renoir is doing that, he's actually seated in a wheelchair, too. Indeed. We can just go to a photo of Renoir at work about at the same time. And there are several things to take away from this. I want to note, first of all, the productivity of these years of Renoir's. This was a really successful period of his life. That is, his late period. And certainly Renoir felt that he had much more work to do, too. He said to one person at this point, "I'm starting to know how to paint. It's taken me over 50 years labor to get this far, and it's not finished yet." And indeed, he produced about 400 works, more than 400 works during this time. They've been attributed to him in these years. Sacha Guitry was not the only one who came and visited him, too. There were a parade of really significant figures who came to watch Renoir doing what we've just seen, too, visiting him in his studio. The young Picasso actually purchased 7 of Renoir's works that were produced at this time, too. And Picasso's friend and colleague, Guillaume Apollinaire, the avant-garde art critic, even went so far as to really breathlessly note in 1914, Renoir is the greatest living painter whose least production is hungrily awaited by a legion of dealers and collectors. At the same time, I want to point out to you that we have just seen Renoir at work. And with rheumatoid arthritis, he was clenching his brush perpetually in his clenched fist. That is, it was permanently sort of tightened. And you guys saw how Claude places the cigarette and the paintbrush into that. Renoir at this point was painting basically in a space that was about a foot by a foot. That was as much as his arm was letting him move. And I also want to note, as you guys saw, there's a kind of rhythmic process to this painting. So he was really using bodily, his body, and shifting it back and forth too as he was working that paintbrush. So these whole body movements swaying back and forth with the brush strokes too. Now, I do want to proceed to this idea of crip objects, because these are some of the objects that were actually in that movie, although it's a little bit hard to see them in the black and white terms. We're looking now at Renoir's easel, his paint box, a wheelchair, all in his home and museum in southern France now, but they look to be the same ones that we saw in the movie too. And in this recreation of his studio, just like in the film, we know that Renoir was usually seated in a wheelchair. In fact, they had pushed him up to the canvas right before Guitry started that film. Renoir actually owned a number of different wheelchairs. So he had this one down in southern France. He also owned this one. This is at his country house in Champagne as well. He had different types of wheelchairs. This is what we usually call a bath chair. So it's not the kind of chair that you would use indoors, but was meant to go on longer, quote unquote, walks, when you're going out of doors. We also have this thing down in southern France, which I find especially interesting. This is actually a sedan chair, which is very much like the old 18th century sorts of chairs that people were carried around in. And I think you can see the bars that allowed that to happen. And Renoir used this so that he could go out of doors. And you can, if you look really closely in this photograph of Renoir painting, you can see the bars of the sedan chair pointing outwards. I have a terrible picture here, but it is a picture of Renoir being carried in the chair by his chauffeur and the cook. They both are carrying him so that he can do the kind of outdoor painting that he enjoyed to do so much too. He liked to work outdoors. One thing should also be stressed is that he was not only just very prolific at this time, but he had also begun to work larger and larger too. In order that the seated painter could, with his limited arm movements, reach all parts of the canvas, a remarkable set of objects have been created too. Although the Guitry film really shows him, he's working on a very small scale canvas in that film that I just showed you. Renoir increasingly undertook life-size paintings, for example, like this one, which is a portrait of his son Jean as a huntsman. The young man stands before us with a gun in hand. It's a pretty large painting. It's almost 5 feet by 3 feet. Renoir's chair, to be able to paint this, had been placed on a trestle, and the trestle was moved up and down and around so that he could reach all parts of the canvas. These actions weren't unusual either. He did that a lot during this period of his painting. But Renoir was not satisfied just with that. In fact, not seen in the Guitry film, but in use by 1915, by the time that film was made, was another crip object, which we have described by people, but unfortunately I don't have a picture of it in itself. But it must have been something like this canvas, which is in place, and people call it various things, a moving easel or a moving canvas. And it seems to have been fashioned from two canisters that were actually one on the top and one on the bottom, and they were attached to a canvas. And the whole apparatus was driven by chains that had been appropriated from Renoir's old bicycle. And what they seemed to be doing, as you could kind of see in the film as well, they were using the apparatus to kind of help his rocking motions, allowing the canvas to move back and forth and up and down as needed. Although I don't have any pictures of it, I'm told that there are a lot of traces on the paintings that he made in this period of the bars from that moving canvas that held it in place. Further to this, As you can see, as we saw in that film, Renoir also used a series of orthotic devices to hold the paintbrush in his hand. Additionally, he did not hold the painting palette in his hand at all. Actually, he's resting it in his knees. I don't know, you can kind of see that on the far right picture here. Eventually, he ended up having the palette rigged to his wheelchair. So it was attached to the wheelchair to enable the kind of smooth and fluid and even rhythmic movements that we saw him kind of applying the paint to the canvas in the film. One could even say that the crypt objects and painting work together in a kind of choreography of movement. Now, to pause here for a moment and go back to my bigger point about cryptistomology, the attached palette and the moving canvas all form a combination of need and resourcefulness, truly crypt objects. I'm mentioning this because in the early 20th century, there were actually a lot of different kinds of assistive devices that were out there, an abundance of stuff really for disabled people, but not for disabled making of the sort that Renoir is doing here. And these are quite cunning in design and clever in execution. There's a kind of ingenuity about them in themselves, but I also fully recognize that there's nothing artistic about them, nothing that an art historian would be especially interested in. None of them are artworks themselves, nor do they even aspire to that. There's no kind of conversation to be had in that way, right? But these creations take us in a different direction, standing at maybe one remove from the traditional conventions of art. And yet they show us a kind of shrewd originality that many disabled people use as they move through the world. And they also gesture towards cryptistomology, a cryptistomology of making, specifically linking Renoir's embodied knowledge with the work on the canvas. So I do want to stress the works themselves, too. As the scholar Martha Lucy has noted, there is a kind of tactility in these late Renoir works, if we were to look at them. The objects instantiate Renoir's ways of knowing and making in the world, but they also foreground a tactile desire as part of the gaze. Now, what's she getting at there? So we could turn to a painting like this. This is considered to be one of the most major of Renoir's late works, The Bathers. And I might add that I understand that a lot of these works, his late works, run counter to contemporary taste. The New York Times art critic, Holland Cotter, has described this image, which is of two nude women reclining in this verdant landscape. It was described as two croissants on a bed of lettuce. In fact, I also understand that it runs counter to our ideas of modernity in art and how the female nude might be painted, and a number of tropes about 20th century art. I want to draw attention, though, to the lightness of Renoir's touch here. The painter's thin, transparent tones were really the envy of people like Henri Matisse, who came many times to Renoir's studio to watch him as he was making paintings like this. Indeed, many observers have commented on the light, kind of velvety, delicate sorts of strokes that establish especially the bather's skin. Recalling the crip objects, and just bear in mind the moving easel, the orthotic device, and how it was used to hold the paintbrush in Renoir's hand, we might cast that a little bit further. In fact, we might just consider the paintbrush as a kind of crip device in its own way. In this case, a kind of extension of the body, or perhaps even a prosthetic in a way. Of course, we've just seen Guitry's film of Renoir's rhythmic application of paint to the canvas, and his manner of deploying crip objects is a kind of choreography of movement, to be sure. I mentioned this again specifically in terms of disability gain. In this choreography of touch, Renoir's not following prescribed rules of beauty, too. Returning to his earlier remark, that is, it's taken me over 50 years, of labor to get this far. I should add that it doesn't seem that much like labor at all when you're actually watching him at work. There's a kind of sensual intensity to that and to the works themselves. As Jean Renoir spoke of his father, who was painting with the moving easel, incidentally, and using all these other crip devices, Jean Renoir notes that other men touching a thing will often try to caress it. Not so his father, as Jean recalls his father saying, "What goes on inside my head doesn't interest me. I want to touch, or at least to see." In many ways, I want to consider the paintbrush then as a prosthetic or assistive device, as well as an aesthetic device. Above all, it communicates tactility and even sensitivity to touch, echoing Renoir's obsession with these soft, touchable nudes. As Martha Lucy notes, Renoir painted hundreds and hundreds of nudes that stimulated the urge to caress, foregrounding tactile desire as part of the gaze. By the last decade of Renoir's life, the suggestion of tactility was really an obsession in these late paintings. And it's also evidence of a way of feeling and knowing and making. I want to turn now to my second case study, who is, in fact, Degas. I want to look at his stenoptic slit and the sense of the strange exactitude in his work. So let's now turn back to movies. And again, we have a movie of Degas. Let's just go ahead and watch it. It's very, very short. So yeah, this is Degas approaching us right there, the big bushy beard coming down the street, and there he goes. Okay, so you have seen now Degas in action. I want to point out, here we can just look at some stills of that. It's pretty brief, and it's brief for a reason. So here's what happened. Sacha Guitry was making this film, a large film, which was supposed to be for wartime propaganda. He was supposed to be making a case for French kind of creativity and culture, and it was supposed to be a pushback against German propaganda and the idea that of a German cultural superiority. So Guitry had gone around France, and he was filming various great French cultural heroes. Renoir welcomed him into his studio. You could tell Renoir had a great time talking to him, too. Not so Degas. So Guitry showed up at Degas' house, and he knocked on the door, and Degas, who's a misanthrope and really quite isolated at this point, Degas refused to let him into the room at all and slammed the door. So Guitry then had this brilliant idea of setting up the film camera down at a cafe, a couple of doors down from Degas' house. And that's basically what you saw. He knew Degas would come out regularly to go on walks. And so we saw that little snippet of Degas coming towards the film camera. It's an interesting in itself, says a lot about Degas, right? It's fascinating, though, too. There are a couple of things I just want to point out to you. First of all, it is wartime France. There are mainly women on the streets. It's actually quite uncrowded for Montmartre sidewalks. There are a couple of men in uniform, too, which you can see if you look closely as well. The other thing is, and it was probably a little bit hard to tell, but as Degas was coming towards us, he's walking towards us, but there's a moment at which it almost looks like he's going to run into that light, but he does go around it. The next thing is, and you can see that in my still over there on the far right, actually, he's with his niece, and his niece, just look closely, sees the camera. Yeah. And so then turns to him and points it out to him, and it is she who's pulling him away. He doesn't see it, though. And in fact, I do want to point out that Degas is, in fact, almost blind at the time that we're watching this. This brings forward all kinds of fascinating things, and I would love, as an aside, to explore the idea of the blind flaneur, because we use this type in 19th century art all the time, the man about town who sees things. And here we have a flaneur. Actually, we're watching a man about town walking around, but he's not seeing things clearly. Anyhow, it's something to talk about if you're interested during the Q&A. The one crip object I do want to draw your attention to in this is his umbrella. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but both he and his niece are both carrying umbrellas, but he actually is deploying his umbrella differently. He's using it like a cane. And she writes about this later, how he tapped it on the sidewalk. So he's using it as an assistive device to navigate his way through the streets of Paris. And he walked a lot at this point. He was out and about, but I pointed out as how adaptive Degas is in a subtle sort of way, too. So, with that crip object in mind, and I should say, too, he had a big collection of walking canes. And I'm not going to take you through all the photographs of the canes. I'm trying to, at this point, start reassembling what his collection looked like. But in any case, Degas, is carrying his umbrella here. He's navigating his way through the world. And much like Renoir, his disability was really widely known. It was widely known as well as his kind of ever-changing vision. I want to investigate this, though, not only in terms of crip objects, but I also want to think about this question of what the critic Huysmans described as Degas' ability to evoke the strange sensation of exactitude in his paintings. Now, we do have a few images of Degas using some of these crip objects. Degas had very much a pronounced and different embodiment for the longest amount of time than any of these different men who we're talking about. At least he had it throughout most of his adult life, to be sure. This is a portrait of Degas by his friend Marcellin de Boutin, and it depicts Degas reading a paper, and you can see he's got, actually, it's not a monocle, but a kind of pince-nez, sort of eyeglasses that are balanced on his nose. He's using the glasses to read. We know he used a lot of different assistive devices to read. He used these. He had a monocle as well. He had various reading glasses. He eventually resorts in the end to a large magnifying glass, and he stops then after a certain point too, even trying to read. As the Degas scholar, Roy McMullen, has pointed out to us, Degas' work, though, also is fascinating in terms of this question of vision. Degas shows a real fascination with vision itself in his work. Roy McMullen has noted how Degas' work in it, you can often you see yourself seeing yourself. Indeed, Degas frequently paints others looking through in various ways or using objects themselves to see. But one example that I'm showing you here is a Degas painting of a woman with the field glasses to her eyes. She seems to be using them to see, but she's also staring directly out at us. I want to add, too, that Degas was actually really highly selective in his use of such objects for himself. It's a fact that it's actually, as I say, quite rare to find pictures of Degas actually using the glasses that he had, and we don't have accounts of him using them in his studio by any means. Instead, as the Degas scholar Richard Kendall has observed, he seemed to choose to live in a softly focused world of the myopic. There is considerable evidence for this as well, but we might turn specifically to Degas' own use or lack thereof of field glasses like these. As a friend once observed, one day they were at the races and they happened to be next to Détail, a friend of theirs, and the latter borrowed his field glasses. When he turned around and gave them to Degas, and here's the quote, when he gave them back, Degas remarked, "Just like a Meissonier, isn't it?" Now, Meissonier is the painter I'm showing you here, Meissonier's painting of Napoleon on a horse. And Meissonier was famous for his incredibly meticulously detailed paintings. But Degas is almost derisively saying that the field glasses make you be able to see things like Meissonier, as if that's a negative thing, to be able to have that kind of focus on one's vision. As Kendall has noted, instead, as I say, not only did Degas prefer to live in this kind of world of a kind of softly focused world, but that's instructive. That's something to think about. Now, with this in mind, I want to turn to the most unusual of Degas' crip objects, which is this pair of synoptic spectacles, which were prescribed for him by an ocular specialist. After years of consultation with doctors and the invocation of home remedies, and he was going to spas, and he also was going on these rest vacations, Degas eventually resorts to treatment from a series of different professional oculists. These lenses were prescribed as corrective, too, just to be clear. The idea was to sharpen and exercise the part of Degas' vision that was normative. So they were blacking out the eyes exactly where they were the most non-normative. So that should give you a sense of, at this point, the limited range of vision that was remaining to Degas. It does also give us a sense of his ways of being in the world, specifically both his field of vision and also his processes of perception, too. But I want to emphasize there isn't much evidence that he actually used these glasses. In fact, he refers to them in one letter, at least, denigrating them as a kind of embarrassing contraption, is what he calls them. These and a whole series of other crip objects are actually in the d'Orsay Museum, and these are just some of them that Degas owned. They do give us, though, some insight into this thing, the strange exactitude of Degas' art. It's also quite notable that he had not only this kind of limited range of vision, but these kind of contraptions, too, tell us a lot about his personal fascination with the processes of perception that he experiments with so much in his art. So just for a quick moment to kind of explore that idea, with the idea of the strange of vision and Degas' ability to exploit it in terms of a kind of artistic gain, I just want to turn to one of the pastels, of which the sort that he's so famous for in his maturity. This is his Woman at a Bath. And here we see this woman who's distractedly turns her back to us. She kneels in a tub. She's grasping a towel with her while rubbing her hip. We see her from directly above. And Degas' ability, as Kendall has noted, to restructure visual experience is pretty clear here. His relationships with people and objects, or lack thereof, is also pretty notable, too. It's an odd angle to be seeing this, in which she almost seems to be kind of directly at our feet and suggests that she's almost kind of thrust in front of us, in front of our vision. These sort of unexpected and close angles are quite typical of the kind of cropping and fragmentation that Degas used. These are really bold visual devices that we associate with the artist's maturity. But I want to stress from observers' accounts, from the crip objects that he had, that is Degas' glasses, the knowledge of the myopia, we know that Degas' vision helped him favor positions in which he was quite close to his subjects. He liked to get close to the subjects, and there's a reason for that. And that comes through in the images, too. He didn't favor distant views. And indeed, there's a lot of evidence that actually in his studios, he would construct platforms and other structures that helped him peer down at his subjects from a chosen, but usually pretty close, but quite vertiginous sorts of viewpoints. In examining other works, too, we can see some evidence of these ideas, too. I'm just showing you here the star. And we see this lone ballerina. She's taking a solo turn across an otherwise empty stage. It's brilliantly lit with artificial light. Behind her, we can see what the audience cannot. So we have this kind of sidelong view, and we can see the other dancers and men behind the stage. They're all obscured in the wings, but visible to us from the sides. A number of really sharp, detailed areas on the dancer's body. It's principally her lower face, especially it's that black ribbon around her neck, and some of her uplifted arm, this is all in the center of the composition, are quite well defined. But a lot of other things are less defined, and even though they're on the same picture plane, they're not farther away. Elsewhere, too, I'll just point out the backstage, the other ballerinas waiting there, the men, all fall away in kind of a blurred indistinctness. Not only are some objects in the foreground and in the background out of focus, but also features of the ballerina herself. Things that are on the same plane are loose and indistinguishable. In fact, there's logic of Degas' vision is not the logic of a camera, just to be really, really clear, or necessarily how other people's eyes work either, but in fact suggest a highly focused, quite selective, almost willful concentration on certain elements. Others are skipped over in his gaze. In fact, it could be argued that there's this knowledgeable understanding here of an artistic potential selective focus, describing some things in detail and an appreciation of the virtues of not seeing other things very well. And this, just to be clear, would be the opposite of what, say, Meissonier was doing, where you see all these details and it's kind of overwhelming and distracting in a lot of his paintings. And Degas, of course, had so openly dismissed that. Of course, in art history, such compositions are usually associated with Japanese woodblock prints and, the cropping we think of and associate with the advent of photography. And I don't mean to dismiss those possibilities as influences, nor am I trying to medicalize the art of Degas. I'm just suggesting in this reading that a different kind of way of thinking also about these arguments about his myopic vision. I want to make clear that there's considerable agency here. And that's where I'm speaking about this idea of crip gain. I do want to suggest Degas, as well as his crip objects, really is inspired by his way of perceiving the world. He's clearly comfortable with having objects and people quite close to him. And there's also a large degree of creative selection, discrimination, artistic manipulation that's going on here. And we could say that, just to follow further, the observation of Degas' friend Charles Efrusy, who in a way almost sounds like he's answering Huysmans' remark about the strange. Efrusy goes on to note that the impression may be strange, but it certainly is captured with great accuracy. And it is a type of accuracy that you see here. To go back to the crypt objects of Degas that I'm just showing you a few of the ones that are in the Musée d'Orsay, and all of these things, almost all of them, are just sitting in the collections. It's not like they're out for people to see. I don't even know how much people are aware of them. But in bringing up this question of vision and cryptistomology in relation to Degas' work, I want to return to this, the treasure trove, as I often think of it, of crypt objects, that once belonged to the artists. He amassed a lot of tinted glasses, and this is in a period where people were not wearing sunglasses, just to be clear, too. They testify also to Degas' unusual relationship with light. So Degas first remarked on an extraordinary sensitivity to light in the early 1870s, and by this point, he even went and visited his mother's family in New Orleans, and in 1872, he writes to a friend back in Paris, and he's fascinated with the city of New Orleans, the New World in general, but he also states really clearly what lovely things I could have done rapidly, if the bright light was less intolerable to me. Returning to France, Degas continued to report on this sensitivity, and I just want to make it clear that he was well known for certainly the kind of dimness of his studio. Not only that, but it looks like he also did wear glasses, these tinted glasses at home. I'm showing you here a photograph of Degas at home with his good friend Paul Bartholomé. And it shows the pair of them in Degas' apartment. Degas seated at a desk most distant from us. And he's facing a really strong illuminated glow of a lamp that remains outside of the picture frame. Degas wears smoked glasses, very possibly one of the ones that are over in the museum that I just showed you. And he's facing the light, but he's also covering his eyes. When we look at these sorts of works by Degas, we might say that his unusual sensitivity adds an unusual strength to his fascination with light. Many works, like Degas' depiction of the famed singer Emily Bécot, who we're seeing here at the Ambassador's Cafe, do take place outdoors, actually, but at night. Looking beyond the murk of these three silhouetted women who are all in the foreground, we see this acid greenish light of gas illumination on the stage. Indeed, Degas' nighttime works sometimes are referred to as gaslight impressionism. And when people use that term, they're trying to contrast him against Monet, who is well known, of course, for those really sunlit grain fields or beaches or scenes of gardens. Here, the singer takes a bow, but is almost lost to us, appearing rather small and lost in a complex cast light coming from nighttime chandeliers, from gas footlights, exploding fireworks. There's a ton of different lights here, of different types of lights, standing street lamp as well. What I'm trying to do is to suggest that this evokes Degas' particular sensitivity and point of view. That Degas, a cryptistomology, if you will, his sensitivity to light should not necessarily be read as a deficit either. I think that's the thing that usually takes place here. It may also explain, in part, his rather dismissive reaction to the art of his fellow impressionists, many of whom were working outdoors, in plein air. And Degas, in his maturity, routinely worked he routinely dismissed that kind of painting. In fact, landscapes are quite rare in Degas' work, and the ones that we do have generally tend to be from memory. Instead, with Degas' works, and I would just turn to one of his major works like this, The Absinthe Glass, we know that Degas, unlike many of the avant-garde contemporaries that he had, like Monet and Renoir, Degas really focuses on psychological complexity, of course, with his sitters. Here we're looking at this woman. He's pairing her with this man. She's sitting dejectedly, of course, in this corner of a fashionable cafe. She's slumped over a green glass of absinthe. The man next to her, is he with her? Is he not? It's hard to know. He's staring off in another direction, distant, bored. Instead of placing his figures in some kind of expansive outdoor space, which Monet, for example, might have done, Degas, of course, uses interiors and to his advantage, focusing on people and their emotions. In this case, capturing the pair against an interior wall, catching them in this kind of, up against a kind of shadowy reflective mirror. Returning to this idea of cryptistomology and ways of knowing, we might understand that Degas' disability gave him an unusual power, allowing him to look at the world in a different way. I want now to turn, in my final example, to the artist Monet. And once again, we can turn to another film by Sacha Guitry. So yeah, let's go ahead, Nadia. So here we have Guitry. He's actually over there on the left, and he's talking with Monet. And again, you get a sense of a very different kind of personality. Guitry's family were friends with Monet, and Guitry he's come to the Valley of the Seine. He's at Giverny. And the two of them engaged in this kind of friendly conversation. And as you can see as well, yeah, not only are they talking, but now we're going to pan across the water lily pond. And then far over here, we see Monet at work. It's a little bit hard to imagine Monet actually went out, painted every day in a white suit like this. But nevertheless, I think he's prepared for the filmmaker, right? I'd love to look at that cigarette. It's you keep waiting for the ash to fall off. Monet clearly is involved in what he's doing. And it's fascinating to see the way that he approaches the water lilies, palette in hand. Notice the way, he takes these quick looks at his subject and then returns over and over to the canvas that's in front of him. Okay, we can stop with that, Nadia. Thank you. With that in mind, I do want to think a little bit further about what we just saw here and to also think about this kind of question, again, of cryptistomology. So indeed, Monet, we've seen, was painting outside in plein air. He was also well known for his visual perceptiveness at this time. That was really what gave Monet a kind of artistic stature at this moment when Guitry comes in 1915. And in fact, we know that people like Paul Cézanne summed up probably a whole generation's respect for Monet when he described Monet, sized him up by saying, "Monet is only an eye, but my God, what an eye." To think even further about Monet's moment of career, we've been kind of witness to this extraordinary moment. You can barely tell it in Guitry's film, though. Monet's late work actually was shaped by pretty substantial changes in his vision, and they enable him to rethink his practice and create what's often called his last magnum opus, which is that water lilies painting. For his part, Monet remarked to his friends, "My sensitivity, far from diminishing, has been sharpened by age, which holds no fear for me, so long as unbroken communication with the outside world continues to fuel my curiosity." I mentioned this because I want to highlight Monet's own words, especially those words sensitivity and unbroken communication with the outside world, as being hallmarks of the idea of cryptistomology and ways of knowing. But also, as a recent exhibition of Monet's late works has stressed, Monet's last years were remarkably productive, and they culminated in the water lily cycle, which many people have called a reinvention of his career on several different levels. In fact, The paintings of the water lilies were an old subject. He was reapproaching an old subject that he first began exploring at Giverny in the 1890s. And that was at the time that they installed the water lily pond there. The project itself presents this interesting visual puzzle for a painter. Of course, what he's really trying to do is paint the reflective surface of the water, making clear that there's a kind of three-dimensionality, that there's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background there at the planar recession. But at the same time, he's also trying to depict the lilies resting on the top of the water, which is quite placid, and then to give a sense of depth below it. But also he has these reflections of what's above, too. So it's a complicated thing that he's doing. You can imagine for a painter of his sort, it'd be fascinating as a challenge. Monet continued to paint this motif over and over for many years, but he seems to have put it aside sometime around the time that his wife Alice died, so sometime maybe around late 1910, 1911. A note from a friend indicates a return to the subject. It's probably around late 1913, maybe early 1914. In fact, he describes running across some water lily paintings in a basement. I don't think that's actually the case because there probably were ones hanging in his house as well. In any case, in reapproaching the subject, Monet himself had grown and changed during this period too. Not only had his wife died, but also his son, Jean Monet, had died. The world around him was also changing. Of course, we're headed right into World War I at this point, which happened, of course, began in that late summer of 1914. In addition to that, Monet himself experienced noticeable changes in his own embodiment. For several years, he had been experiencing the effects of cataracts and found significant shifts in his own vision, too. Just to go back to the Guitry film stills, I do want to point out to you, there's one interesting thing here. For the man who Cézanne described as an eye, that one of the most interesting things in the footage is we can't see his eye at all, right? It's really obscured. That does testify to being outdoors next to the lily pond. In fact, his upper face is obscured. He's under an umbrella. He's wearing a hat. And all evidence is that it's probably pretty bright sunshine when he's out there. And he's experiencing all of that at the edge of a water lily pond, too. Arguably, these might, though, the umbrella, the hat, could also be called crip objects, because as Monet developed these cataracts, that meant he spent less and less time outdoors in direct light, too. Now, Monet actually did own a number of different sorts of eyeglasses, many of them tinted, and he uses them a lot in that final decade of his life. There's this variety of glasses, and I've spent a lot of time matching them to different periods in his career. I'm showing you only one of them here, a green tinted pair, and actually I have a photograph of him. I think he is wearing them here. And I do show you this to help us remember that he experienced a real range of different embodiments at this time. He also underwent 3 different surgeries while working on the water lilies. And I want you to note that in these glasses, one of them, they're both lenses are tinted, but one of them is clear and the other one is practically opaque too. And that also is a reflection of what his vision was at that moment. Indeed, the tinted glasses tell us a lot about a wide variability in Monet's work at this time. Most of the focus, and especially when you get into those medical journals, the focus in the writing about this tends to be on his varied color palette. He would go from these really vivid reds, sometimes burnt kind of browns and oranges, to these sorts of varied and deep, sometimes blues too. I'm happy to talk about that later, but I think today the thing I really want to focus on, especially in the interest of time, is to return to Guitry's film. And I want to point out the palette that Monet is holding. The artist dealt with the variability of his vision in a couple of different ways, and especially that perception of color issue. One of the things that he himself was particularly proud of was the palette and the way he arranged paint on the palette. So as changeable as he found his perception of color, he actually arranged the pigment on the palette in a very specific order. Monet was really, really careful and neat in his studio, and that comes through on the palette. I know the palette looks a little bit messy here, But we have these accounts of the order in which he arranged the color on the palette. And indeed, as his dealer, one of the dealers came, Jean Campbell, into his studio, he describes what the system is. And you can see it on the palette if you look carefully. So what we're looking at, he says, Monet actually had memorized this order of cobalt next to ultramarine blue, violet, vermilion, something called combat ochre. I think it's supposed to be ochre, not ochre. Orange. Yeah. That's great, isn't it? In a way, it'd be better if it were a combat ochre. In any case. So you can get a sense here about his various ways of dealing with his changed vision. And indeed, this is a particular aspect of Monet's knowing and making, too. Now, just to go back to the Guitry film, there was that quick moment in which we situated Monet right next to the water lily pond. And I want to, especially in terms of cryptistomology, I want to return to that moment and mine it a little bit more, because we see Monet, he's painting, but also he's painting out of doors, and the cataracts actually made that increasingly kind of vexed. He did wear glasses more and more, but he also started at this time to shift his work more and more indoors. In fact, we're told that he tried to avoid strong light, that he was only out at certain times in the morning, certain times in the afternoon at this point. I want to point out to you also, just look at that canvas. It's big. It must be something like 5 feet, almost 6 feet, in fact. And indeed, just imagine having to take those canvases in and out every day. Now, he had his family and a whole team of gardeners that helped move those canvases according to what the light was like. But I do want to say that that could be quite cumbersome. And I would argue that the shift indoors offered Monet all kinds of new possibilities, too. In fact, the more he was indoors, the more remarkably inventive he became, allowing him to work larger and larger. Indeed, the very first water lily paintings from the 1890s are easel paintings. But working indoors really helped him to increase the sort of space that he was allowed or able to work with. He begins to reconceive his work really large as wall murals. To be clear, then, even as Monet's vision changes, he doesn't give up painting. Instead, he begins this really rigorous, taxing painting regime, undertaking to recreate his beloved garden indoors. As he does this, he begins to hang his various canvases on the walls side by side, and I can't overemphasize that. In fact, Monet really clearly, certainly worked indoors in the past. You know, he would finish these paintings that he was painting outdoors. He would typically finish them up indoors. But here he really starts to understand his painting in a new way. Now, in this photograph I'm showing you here, this is a photograph from about 1915. So it's right about the time that Sacha Guitry visited Monet. And it's taken in Monet's salon studio, as it was called. Hanging on the wall behind him are several easel paintings of the water lilies. These are older ones. And you can see that they're hung not only really densely in what we call a salon-style hanging, but each one of them feels kind of fragmented and isolated. They don't feel like a unit that flow together. The effect is very different from the reinvention that he is going through at this time, in which Monet begins to conceive and reconceive this same motif, but in a very different way. Indeed, indoors, we see Monet here with a palette in hand and with the water lily murals behind him. Indoors, not only could Monet work large, but he could also hang these canvases side by side by side. And what he would do is sometimes move from one canvas to another, so it wasn't like he was limited to just one at any particular time indoors here too. All the while, he's also basically creating a kind of panoramic cycle, in effect recreating the outdoor sort of aquatic garden, the lily pond, that he enjoyed so much outdoors. This way of conceiving his art meant a whole new way of making for Monet. As this reinvention begins to capture Monet's imagination, he begins to really think about the artistic possibilities, and he lets his imagination go with him too. He doesn't spare any effort or cost, I should say, even as France was at war at this point. Remember, we're in 1915, and building materials are scarce. Monet pulled strings in really powerful corners of the French government. He even got the French president, Georges Clemenceau, to help him get building material and to rebuild a new studio. This is his third studio at Giverny, and it's just been constructed. And you'll notice how high the ceilings are, that it's built specifically to accommodate these huge canvases, which are placed on these movable rollers, and they're resting on the ground. Significantly, they were becoming in a kind of art in the round, surrounding and configuring him with these massive images. Now, just to think about the water lilies themselves, returning to cryptistomology, I want to point out that they recreate the garden, giving the viewer an enveloping sense of complete immersion. It's a sensory experience that submerges us into Monet's experience. As one observer at the time said, it's as if we're being plunged fully into the great artist's passion for color and hundredfold dream. Just to look at what they are composed of too, what do we see? Essentially, Monet has recreated his own worldview here. It's a personal experience of his water lily gardens. And in these paintings, we see, for example, these really compressed horizonless images in which there are these painted clusters of lilies that are floating on the top of the pond. There are these iridescent blossoms, sometimes too, dotting the waterscape. But there's also here a silhouetted trunk and some branches from a willow tree too. They also depict the shifting light atmosphere, the time of day. In this detail, we see not just the lilies, but reflections of clouds from the sky above. We could equate these to the earlier paintings. It's the same subjects, but unlike those really small paintings that we saw that he was working on of water lilies from previous decades, the sheer size, the magnitude of these, and the scale of these murals enabled Monet to explore really expansively the waterscape that constituted Giverny. In closing, I want to think and rethink this magnum opus in terms of cryptistomology. Indeed, both the studio and especially in the final installation, which is at the Orangerie Museum, here I'm showing you the way that Monet wanted you to be able to see these. In his final years, he went to a lot of trouble dictating exactly how these water lily panels should be disposed. And of course, this is just off the Tuileries garden, and the water lily cycle is really carefully placed in the museum. It's been read variously. Some people look at it and say it's like a recreation of a 19th century panorama in which you would walk into these kind of circular rooms, and you usually had a 360-degree view, usually of palaces or cities, and often painted really in precise detail. This is very different from that, though. Indeed, I want to dwell for a moment in closing on the construction and shape of this room. Now, originally, it had been sited on land behind the Hotel Biron, which is the grounds of the Rodin Museum today. And the building was initially conceived as what could be called a circular room. This is what the design of it was. But that site could not be secured. And then Monet got really dissatisfied. So he went to the architect of the Louvre, Camille Lefebvre, and there the two of them worked together. They decided to take over the Orangerie, which was already in existence, and it was a kind of rectangular building. And the two of them have cunningly reconfigured this space. Visitors enter into a vestibule with soft white walls and daylight pouring in through kind of paned skylights. Then they pass into the first room of the Water Lilies Gallery, and they're immediately surrounded by 4 murals, all 2 meters in height and aligned at the same distance from the floor. These, incidentally, are glued to the wall, so you cannot move them around as well. So they're meant to be permanent, exactly the way that Monet wanted you to see them. So they no longer are really distinguished, too, as individual art objects hanging on the wall like you would see in a museum, but they're meant to be experienced as a singular entity. Of course, everything that I've just recounted to you now, what I'm saying to you is really a work in progress, but this fascinates me, and Monet's Orangerie Gallery and the whole kind of space design and configuration, I think, merit a more nuanced analysis. There are 8 canvases there, and nothing, they've really been customized in the sort of display practices by Monet at the height of what I would say were his crip powers, too. Yes, displayed in the round, or maybe I guess I should say in the oval, right? As it were. There are these immersive strategies that he uses in which he's mixing the material environment and the physical gallery, and it's all within the perceptual field of Monet, the way he wants you to see things. In closing, I want to rethink this space and suggest that it in itself is kind of ocular. That is, returning to that image that I started us with, that diagram of the human eye. And of course, I mentioned this in terms of the development of science and medical profession in the 19th century. But I also want to now draw your attention to something different. So returning to Lefebvre and Monet's plan, I want to point out that the room itself has come to resemble an eye. And in fact, both of the display rooms are these ovals now. They are these kind of pragmatic and perceptual. There are reasons for doing this. So, it was a rectangular building, and it's hard to put a circular room into it. You'd be wasting a lot of space. So it makes sense in a way that they moved over to the kind of more oval sorts of shapes. Also, there's something quite immersive in doing this. It does work with human vision. It replicates human vision in certain ways, too. But overall, I also just want to say that enveloping illusionism, what we're left with, it's removed from any kind of context of the home or the garden or the studio. It's really become something else when you go there. Ultimately, I want to point out that placed together too, these things resemble that crypt object, that those glasses that Monet had too. It almost looks like two eyes are looking out at you. Indeed, the thing that was so dominated Monet's life and his embodiment has now shaped this space. The eye of Monet has, in fact, undergone really profound changes during this time. And ultimately, in effect, it's been reanimated here in the ultimate crypt space, if you will. The kind of reinvention that Monet has created here is entirely different. And with that, I close. Thank you so much for being a good audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that incredibly fascinating talk. It really, I think, changes the way we see all of these very familiar pictures, and in sort of brilliant and inventive ways. So thank you. I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. Let's see, I saw Freya's hand shot up. So,
I just want to make sure I can get in because I have a feeling there are going to be lots of wonderful comments. I just want to say, first of all, that I'm so excited for this to be a book and to be able to luxuriate in it and teach with it. And one of the reasons is that I'm sure this is obvious to most of us, but I just want to call out the fact that at first I was thinking, oh, this is the most amazing triangulation of design history, disability studies, and art history. But actually, by the end, it's a quadrangulation, which I don't think is even a word. But I mean, there's architectural history happening as well. And that's just, to me, especially a really incredible model of scholarship that I really admire. So that's just something I wanted to make note of. And the other thing is much more pedestrian. But that is, I wonder whether, you brought up photography a few times, and I think it's so interesting in this period that painting and photography are really coming head to head, and especially with Degas, there's, as you mentioned, this kind of history of looking at the croppings, and but also the notion that maybe there is some kind of objective way of seeing, that the camera shows us, the way it really is. And I wonder about, first of all, the kind of question of whether, is part of your argument or is part of this project also about the idea that maybe there is no objective way of seeing it all. And I guess the second piece, which is the kind of most maybe historical, is whether you're also looking at texts from the period that talk about kind of the pathology of vision. I mean, I know, Max Nordau, this crazy German doctor who really looked at impressionism as a pathology,
Yeah.
and then some others who do a similar thing, sort of both good and bad, but this sort of sickness of the late 19th century that makes people see things in a weird way. And I'm just curious if you're dealing with that too.
Yeah, that's a great question, and of course, that's actually where I had started this project, was with those salon reviews, because that was the thing that the critics were all saying. Not all of them, but actually the reviews were quite nuanced. But when in that first Impressionist exhibition, the most famous review calls them basically mad and blind, and it's such a funny thing because in the end, they actually did have these interesting kinds of subjectivities, but it's just not the way that those critics were describing it. The fact is, we talk about Impressionism objectivity. That was the trope that was used a lot throughout the 20th century, as if they were just recording what they were seeing with their eyes. But that's been kind of disproven. I mean, clearly every person sees something differently. Each of us sees the world differently. Subjectivity is our claim to our own individuality. You're right, though, that there is that interesting discussion, there's a medicalizing that goes on in the 19th century, and it's fascinating to me. So within disability studies, there is this trajectory that we use where we talk about the 19th century as well as medicalizing and trying to kind of make a claim for normality. And that's something that I think also you have to measure that sort of argument against, because there is this really strong push for what is considered normal and what's not normal. And that's part of the basis of our understanding to this day of certain kind of pathologies and the rest of it too. And I think Nordau is playing off of that too. Thanks for bringing that up. It's a great topic. I have a really short article in Art in America from a couple of months ago about the kind of reception that these guys got at the salon, because it's just such an interesting discussion. Yeah, thanks. Other questions? Yeah. Oh, sure, please.
Yeah. You started off by saying Monet and blue, but you didn't really address that. And also, keep thinking of Chuck Close.
Oh, yeah, it's so funny that you mentioned that. Yeah, because I did a run through of this talk to a friend of mine who's a scholar of disability studies, and that was his first thing. Tell them about Chuck Close. Yeah, exactly. Well, first with Chuck Close, for those of you who are not familiar with Chuck Close's work, of course, he was somebody who underwent a very distinct change in his own life. And I don't recall exactly what it was, but I know he ended up a wheelchair user. And it changed his art significantly. And his career grew and blossomed with that. And that's something that's really important to remember today. But to go back to Monet and the blue, so you're asking me, why were they talking about Monet seeing blue? That at the beginning, but I didn't say anything about it. Yeah, I mentioned it towards the end just slightly because there's so much writing about those different colors of these different paintings after each surgery. And, they get into what happens when you have certain type of cataract surgery. And he had it in one eye, not in both. But yeah, he was, there's a lot of writing about it, and some people say that he complained a lot about just seeing blue after one of those surgeries. And then he wore a different type of lens, which ultimately it's the lens maker for those the glasses that seem to correct it, still to this day show off those glasses because they were really cutting edge at the time. He was one of the first people to use them, the Meyerowitz glasses. So it's a fascinating story in itself. Yeah, it's a little hard. And the challenge I'm having with this work, I'll just tell you guys straight out, is that there's been a lot written about this. None of what I've said to you is particularly new. The challenge of what I've been doing is I'm switching everything inside out. So I'm constantly positing not anything as negative. And that's the way that, like, the glasses and the seeing blue has always been posited that way. And what I'm trying to do, and I think you can make an argument for a growth that happens. Interesting things are happening here. And I think it's worth thinking about that as well. So, getting into the blue or is it red and stuff like that, there's no doubt I'm going to be having to deal with that more. But it has been a challenge. I have to tell you, this is some of the hardest work I've ever done. Trained as an art historian, because I'm totally going against everything that my professors told me about this art. So, but it's fun too in that way. Other questions?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more.
Okay.
Yes, that's great. Noah, yeah.
Thank you. First of all, yes, I am very interested.
Great.
It was 18th century wheelchairs in France. And so I guess a kind of a selfish question I have to ask is, how do you, in your research and in how you present it in your writing, come to terms both with period conceptions of illness and disability, as well as modern conceptions in the 21st century? Because I think those are both two biased ways of viewing sort of the events and the sensory phenomenon of a person's life.
Yes. And of course, in a way, what I'm really doing is playing a game here too. It's an intellectual game too, where I'm taking a pretty well-written script and rereading it in a different way, in a 21st century way as well. But you're right, when you get back to the 18th century, it's funny though, with assisted devices, and having done a lot of research also on those wheelchairs and canes and the rest of it, they function differently for different people and they're read differently. A lot of it in those cases has to do with your class. And people from the upper classes, a man using a cane there, it's a sign of his power and his sophistication. And somebody who is begging on the street and has a cane is seen very differently too. So in some ways, it's easy for us to kind of make a critique like that. But you're entirely right that the whole idea of cripping, my friend Alexandra from the Institute of Fine Arts, de Courtois, and I have been doing some work on the idea of cripping and trying to look broadly at the 19th century in terms of cripping. And the first thing Alexandra and I started talking about was, is it right to use this word cripping? Because they weren't using it then, and it really doesn't even work. But then we decided there's a kind of friction that happens when you do it, and if nothing else, it starts getting you thinking in interesting ways. So I hear you. You're right. I'd love to see your work, incidentally. Thanks. That was a good question.
Well, we're just at 7:30, and I want to thank Elizabeth for a fantastically illuminating and thought-provoking talk, and hope that you will follow Elizabeth's work as this comes out for publication, which I hope will be very soon. Thank you so much.
All.